Okay, so we'll begin. It's kind of crazy we're doing this again, but we'll begin by saying a chapter of Tehillim for our brothers and sisters who are still captive and still dealing with all the craziness. And God willing, this will be the last time we'll have to do this tefillah. We'll do chapter 121. Shela Malay says, "Eine alarm mein Yom is yimi imadinai oisish my maretz. Yitim like Rablacha Yom Shemracha Igni Layanam Laishan Shem Yisrael. And Meshim Racha Bitzulcha Yatiminacha Yen Mashem Mesh Layakeka. Yarbeach Balayla. And Yishmach Mekara Yishmar Nashacha. And Yishmar Sesef Layach Matvadela." And this, the Torah we learned today should stand for them as well in good and bad. Okay, so we're continuing with our journey through Meet the Giants, the history of Halacha. And last week we established really the foundation, the underpinnings of understanding how Halacha operates, which sets us on the course for the next 4 weeks from tonight and then 3 following. And it took us up till the Mishnah. And what we come down to is essentially that when Hashem gave the Torah at Sinai, He gave a written text, and He gave an oral text, an oral tradition. And the oral tradition is a bunch of rules to interpret the main text. And so long as you're following those rules of interpretation, it is legit Torah. So those are the two foundations, the two pillars that we talked about last week that make up all of Halacha, is the text of the Chumash, and then the proper usage of the rules of interpretation applied correctly. Now you have Halacha. Like this, from generation to generation, this is what's being used, and in each generation you have assemblage of sages. Last week, essentially, they were all still in the same location. They're all still in Eretz Yisrael. For a brief period of 70 years between the first and second temple, they were in Persia, but they're essentially in Israel the entire time, and therefore they're able to maintain this oral tradition in which the body of scholars, the Sanhedrin, responsible for coming to conclusions following the majority, as the verse says, follow the majority when there's a dispute, and for recording the conclusions of the previous generation. And therefore from generation to generation there's this like elite group of scholars who are preserving the Torah interpretation that's been extrapolated throughout the generations. This is essentially what we discussed last week, right? Okay. So now we start going into Babel, into Babylonia. We're moving now outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the Mishnah was explained last week, which is what Nasi is seeing in advance, well, not in advance, but you see the writing on the wall with Roman persecution of the Jews in Israel, life becoming very hard, Jews slowly moving away. You can see that Torah and Judaism need to become transgeographic. We have to be able to live Judaism outside of a center where you'll have a safe little group of people who are in charge of keeping Torah preserved. We have to make it available to go beyond borders. Along with that comes another element, which I don't think I stressed last week, which should be stressed now because it's going to become more important as we go along. It's not just that Torah becomes transgeographic, that you can take it across borders, whereas beforehand Judaism centered around the temple was very much centered on Israel. You have to be in Israel to properly engage in Judaism. And with Torah, with the Mishnah, that's now a book and a text that you can read anywhere, Torah and Judaism became an engaging life anywhere outside, even not in Israel. Another thing that comes along with that is the democratization of Torah, and that is now available to more people. Initially, you had to be smart enough to make it into a group of people who can actually memorize all this information and actually engage in the process of remembering how to apply the rules without ever referencing a proper text. But now that you have a book, the Mishnah, which anybody can read, now to what degree you can read between the word lines and see what the Mishnah really means to say, okay, that will depend on the level of scholarship. But now already the bar for entry has been way lowered for anyone who wants to engage in Torah study. And this is going to become a theme as we go throughout history, is these two things: making Torah transgeographic, that we can move it around, and it doesn't matter where you are, you can engage in Jewish life by Torah study, and the fact that the bar for entry for Torah study gets lowered and lowered and lowered, to the point that today you don't even have to know Hebrew. There's so much available in English that anybody can pick up anything and read. You don't have to spend years and years in yeshiva to learn Gemara as it was in the previous generations. And certainly only elite scholars in previous generations would have made it to the people who were actually involved in the real study of Torah. As time goes on, more and more people get engaged. And this is a good thing and a positive thing, as we'll see. Now this begins as the Jews move towards Bavel, to Babylonia. This is where Jews are at the time. In Babylonia, it's centered around Iraq. I'll show you a map in a minute of where we are. But when we talk about the first time Jewish life really gets centered outside of Eretz Yisrael, in Babylonia, in Bavel, there are two eras that we're going to look at today. One is, I don't have any pictures from those times, I'm sorry. But I have just two books representing the time periods. The one on the black set of books, that's the Gemara, that's the Talmudic era, and then on the right we have like the cover of page or book is the post-Talmudic era called the Geonim. We're dividing it into two, and we'll see why soon. The Talmudic era and the post-Talmudic era. But both of these are centered in Bavel with a very similar, actually the same system of Jewish life and Torah learning lasted through this entire time period. As we'll see, it's almost 1,000 years. It's a very long time where Jews are very strongly centered in Bavel and Babylonia. So these are the two time periods, the Talmudic era and the post-Talmudic era, what we call the Geonim, which we'll get to. So let's begin with the Talmudic era. Talmudic era, as you can see, like it says the Talmud, and under there write Amoraim. The sages of the Talmudic era are called Amoraim. Amoraim literally means sayers, speakers. As opposed to the Tanaim, which are like teachers, they're the scholars of the Mishnaic era, which we learned about last week. Rabbi Hudan.
How many years was from Mishnah to?
Right away. Rabbi Yochanan, who's an Amoraim, learned from Rabbi Hudan, from Rabbi Hudan also. Right? So there's a generation, you can sometimes even tell in the Gemara if it's Rabbi, but they're not from the Mishnah, it's because they're from the early generation. Like Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Lezer. There's a few people of the early generation that learned from Yehuda, and some of them actually traveled from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, like Kiyasir Rav Dimi, like Rav Dimi came, right? Different people that moved from one place to the other.
Those are, the ones you just mentioned are Amoraim?
Amoraim, they're all Amoraim, but some of them are early generation Amoraim who actually learned from the masters of the Mishnah. Right, so when it doesn't happen automatically, but when you learn like Gemara and you know where to place the people, generally speaking, it oftentimes helps. I'll explain why in a minute. Okay, so the sages of the Gemara are called Amoraim. Okay, now you can see in this little graph here from Chabad.org that there's two. There's a redaction of the Jerusalem Talmud and a redaction of the Babylonian Talmud. And you can see the Babylonian Talmud, which is going to be the main focus of our discussion here, and I'll explain why in a moment, ends about 200 and something years after the Jerusalem Talmud. No, sorry, 120?
Yes.
120. It's still a long time. So what happens is essentially, people are slowly moving towards Babylonia. Some people never left Babylonia. They're still there from the first exile. Not everybody went back. We talked about that last week. Jews in Israel being persecuted. As we saw last week, the Sanhedrin is constantly bouncing around from place to place towards the end of the era of the Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, post-Second Temple destruction. Now, what happens also is that infrastructure, money, becomes centered in Bavel. So slowly, the center of power, like there's a word for it, like the gravity of power moves from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia very slowly. There's a stronghold that's still living in Eretz Yisrael, like idealistically, we're living in Israel, this is where we're going, we're not moving anywhere, and they're continuing the tradition of Torah learning there. But they're not nearly as strong as those in Babylonia. But on the other hand, they have less, if you will, broken telephone. They have more direct line from the people who learned there. So you'll often read in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Talmud Bavli, where they'll all excited say, so-and-so arrived from Israel and he came with new pieces of information, and let's study them. You'll see that quite often. Certain people who traveled from Jerusalem either permanently moved to Babel or came to visit, raised funds, and went back. Sometimes we also find the Gemara controversy about who should decide on certain big global issues, like an issue of a calendar. Right? Certain things are not a global issue, how you observe Shabbos. Okay, so the rabbis here can decide one way, the rabbis there can decide one way, and they're both correct because they're both using the correct rules of interpretation, so no problem. In Jerusalem, they'll behave this way on Shabbos, and in Babel, will behave that way on Shabbos. Right? This is like a prelude to what we're going with the Sephardi Ashkenazi next week, but it's pretty much the same idea. But when you talk about a calendar, let's say, it has to be universal. We can't have people in Babel celebrating treating one day is a separate thing, but let's say they decide to add a month of Adar. Right, so now Pesach is a whole month off. And then Shavuos becomes a month off. And then everything just, so you have to have like one calendar. There was actually one of the Amoraim, Hillel, who put together the calendar that we have today. He was in Babel. And it was a bit of controversy because we're in Israel. We're supposed to be the center of Torah learning. Why are you guys calling the shots? But the end of the day is, as we'll see soon,
Centralized authority was in Babel.
Centralized authority essentially became in Babel. The most basic reason is for the reason you're looking at here, because the redaction of the Talmud in Babel is 100 and something years after the redaction of the Talmud in Jerusalem, which means the final redactors of the Talmud in Babel take into consideration everything the guys in Israel said and still go this way, which means they have their conclusions more final. Because they will take into consideration whatever they're discussing there and say, well, for these reasons, we're taking it further for such a reason. So considering that they're more, it's a principle in Halacha, which is Halacha Kabasroi. The Halacha follows the later authority, assuming that the later authority takes into consideration the previous generations. So because the Babylonian Talmud lasts much longer than they call it the Jerusalem Talmud, but it's not actually the Jerusalem Talmud. They weren't in Jerusalem. They were in the north of Israel, as we saw last week. They were kicked out of Jerusalem by the Romans way earlier. But as paying homage to Jerusalem, they called it the Jerusalem Talmud, considering it their capital, even though they weren't living there. But nonetheless, where was I? The Babylonian Talmud lasts much longer, and therefore the halacha will follow from Babel, with the exception of questions that are related to living in the land of Israel. So the Babylonian Talmud wasn't super concerned with how you observe Shemitah, how you rest the land in the 7th year, because they don't have Shemitah outside of Israel. So the Jerusalem Talmud will cover those laws. So today, when people are moving back to Israel en masse, the Jerusalem Talmud is having a revival because of the halachas, because of the laws that are related to the land of Israel. But aside from that, halacha follows, for the most part, the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, we clear so far? We're a little fast, but hope we're clear so far. Okay, pretty much?
Yeah.
Okay, have any questions? That'd be a good time, then we'll go to the next part. Clear? Okay, so another word on the Gemara. So last week I explained how the Mishnah, the way in which it retained the oral nature of Torah is by not giving full conclusions, just by telling us opinions, not telling you how to actually practice. So now it becomes the job of the one who studies the Mishnah to think about, okay, how did you get to this conclusion? Why are the two of you arguing? How would you have seen the verse differently? And then if we took that logic and applied it to another case that you don't mention, how would you rule? And between the two of you, which way should we go? Right? That's the job of the one learning the Mishnah in order to truly unpack the conversation that the Mishnah is distilling. And that's really what the Gemara is, which is why the Gemara is so, it's not an easy read. This is reason number one, because it's to begin with reverse engineering. They're looking at a Mishnah. This is how a typical page of the Gemara will begin. A Mishnah quotes a Mishnah, and then the Gemara will say, the first words of the Mishnah is X. Well, why wasn't it X? Why wasn't it Y? Well, why did Rabbi Yehuda say it that way and not the other way? Don't we have a verse that says that way? Now, if we fast forward to a Mishnah somewhere else, we see Rabbi Yehuda says it a different way, which means he thinks of the verse in that way. So what did he mean by the verse here? And that's how the Gemara goes on and on and on in pages like that. So that's reason number one for why the Gemara is not an easy read, because it's reverse engineering what were the thought processes of the people in the Mishnah. That's number one. Number two, like the Mishnah, it often doesn't bring conclusions. It'll just give you it'll take you down a tangent of what they all thought, and then leave it there. How should you practice? Now you go reverse engineer the Gemara. This process of reverse engineering that these Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, did to the Mishnah, now you go do to their thinking and figure out how you would follow halacha. That's how it keeps on going. That's reason number two. Reason number three for why the Gemara is so complicated to learn is because it's not written by one person with writing at the beginning with the end in mind. at all. The Mishnah, at least, is one person compiling information he's received over the last hundreds of years. So it's very structured, it's very deliberate from one thing to the next. Every now and again there'll be a tangent in the Mishnah, but not very often. It's very clear. The Gemara, on the other hand, which is what we're referring to as the Talmud here, the Gemara, is really transcripts of conversations. The transcripts of conversations. And these conversations lasted or span hundreds of years. And that's what I'm looking at here at the calendar. From the year, 200 before the Common Era to 500 before the Common Era. That's 300 years of conversations. Which means if I'm at year 150, so in my study hall, there's going to be 150 years already of conversation on the Mishnah. So we're going to be analyzing their conversations, and then someone's going to come up with a new insight. Oh, let's add it to the conversation. And then, in 50 years from now, someone else reads what we wrote and what we thought, and then we'll add 2 other lines to their conversation. And like this, the Gemara will go from one generation to the next, and you never know who's speaking when, because then it could jump back to a previous generation. Right? And so sometimes, if I'm at, let's say, generation 150, and I'm reading page, and I read the whole book that they have at that point, right? So now I go back to page 2, and I say, well, on page 180, you said something else. So all of a sudden, I'll add into the notes on page 2 a whole conversation that's from page 180. So you, the reader now in 2023, pick this up. You're looking at page 2 and it's cross-referencing something on page 180. You're like, what are you doing? We haven't got to page 180 yet. Right? Unless you understand how this works, it's very confusing on why you're doing that. But when you understand, it's a conglomerate of conversations that have taken place over time, and each iteration knows all the conversations in the previous ones, and just interjecting a couple of lines here and there, this is how the Gemara constantly grows. And you get these clues based on who's talking, and based on the phrasing of the way the statements are made, you can kind of place yourself as to where you are within the Gemara's 300-year period of people adding little lines of conversation. So this is another layer that makes learning of the Gemara, learning the Talmud so complicated, because it's not a simple book, you just read through it. It's reverse engineering previous generations, no conclusions, and then this reverse engineering process is a hodgepodge of conversations that have taken place over centuries, and if the people in conversation decide to go on a tangent, the Gemara will take you on that tangent for 2 pages, commenting on social etiquette, commenting on recipes, on ancient medicines, on strange practices or strange observances. It'll tell us about sages who travel to the ports to see different types of fish or different types of plants, like all kinds of things the Gemara will cover. Literally everything and anything is on the table for the Gemara. Nothing is off the table. There's no problem discussing literally anything. Because in these conversations, things come up and they get written down and added. So that's essentially the structure of how the Gemara works. And this is what yeshiva boys are breaking their heads over for hours and hours a day, trying to insert a little line into that conversation. Not that it actually gets printed into a Gemara, but that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to insert yourself into this hundreds of years and now thousands of years conversation, try to hear what they're all saying and try to see where your voice is in this whole conversation. That's really what the exercise of studying in yeshiva really is.
Thank God for footnotes now.
Sorry?
Thank God for footnotes now.
So footnotes will sometimes give you all that background.
It references all the future.
Right. Okay, any questions before we go forward? So we're clear?
The Ravina and the Rashi, they put the Gemara together, no?
They were the last ones. Ravina and Rashi were the final redactors, but there were people did before.
They didn't organize them.
So no one did the job of saying, okay, next week we'll see people who tried to organize it. The Rishonim tried to organize it. The Rif, the Rambam, we'll see how they try to do that. But at this point, they're still living in one central place. There's a few different yeshivas, sort of Pumbedisa, a few different places we'll see in a second, but they're still living all in one place. So they're all still involved in the same conversation. It's not as if they have to transport it to somewhere else and make it organized for someone down there to read. We're all still here. So no one really organized it in a subject fashion, subject 1, subject 2. Just add its conversations and that's it. And even after the Ravina Rashi, you have the abundance of Amoraim. We'll talk about that. Okay, so they go to page 3. On the left, just this Google Maps, so you can see where Israel is and where Baghdad is relative. And then the box on the right, the orange arrow points to a little green type that says Baghdad. So it gives you context as to where we are. All these little cities written out there in Hebrew are all little villages and cities mentioned in the Gemara, mentioned in the Talmud. The big centers are in the bigger letters. So if you can read Hebrew, you can see it says in the top left, Pumbedisa, and you go down that river, it says Naharda. Keep going further down that river, it says Surah, Masamachasir. And if you go to the river that's under Baghdad, or that runs through Baghdad, under that you'll see Mechuzah. These are the big centers. Pumbedisa, Naharda, Surah, Masamachasir, Mechuzah, and later Baghdad as well. So you can see where we are. This is where Jewish life is really happening for this entire period of time. Starting from, we saw before, from 200 CE, but really before, because there's still Jews there from the first exile. But really Jewish life starts to pick up from the year 200 CE and doesn't end in 500. 500 is when the Talmud ends, but Jews are still living there with a very strong presence for the next couple hundred years, as we'll see shortly. Okay. So now we talked a little bit about the structure of the Gemara. We'll read the statement here, where the Gemara talks about itself. The Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud talks about itself and says the following. You should read it quickly. This demonstrates what Rabbi Oshia said. What is the meaning of that which is written? And I took for myself two staves. One I called gracious, and the other I called binders. A verse in Zechariah. Okay. So explains Rabbi Oshia, graciousness, these are the Torah scholars in Eretz Yisrael, who are gracious to one another in discussion of halacha. They treat each other with honor and love, as demonstrated in the statements of Reish Lakish and Yehuda Anasi. Okay, the context is not important. We're just making the following point. Binders, chovlim in Hebrew, these are the Torah scholars in Babylonia who injure, shemechablim, each other in discussions of halacha, i.e. they speak harshly to each other when they disagree. It's pretty good self-promotion. This is the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara talking about itself. Hey, you know those guys in Israel? They're much more polite. We kill each other. This is what he's saying here. Right, but now we understand the context. They're killing each other because their method of learning is not like in Israel where it's all sweet and everybody gets just the tradition gets passed on to the next generation, and the next generation is all perfect. In Babylonia, they're reverse engineering. So they're constantly yelling at each other. No, you're reading it wrong. Read it that way. Well, what if you read it that way? So they're constantly battling out their conclusions rather than the simple process of receiving the conclusions as it was more in staying in Eretz Yisrael and Israel. So which begs the question, why do you follow the Babylonian Talmud? So the first reason I told you earlier, because they lasted longer. The Jerusalem Talmud basically ended 100 and so years before the Babylonian Talmud ended, and because they ended later, they took into consideration the conclusions of the people in Israel, and they took it even further, so we follow them for that reason. But considering, as you just read, they're so much more convoluted, so much more complicated, and so much more discussion and argument. Moreover, the Talmud Bavli says about itself, Machashaka Mashivani quotes a verse, which is, I walk around in darkness. Meaning, they're admitting that they're like wandering through the dark, trying to reverse engineer and understand what's really going on. And yet, so in other words, they're kind of like, quote unquote, putting themselves down, and they're learning not as great as their counterparts in the Holy Land, and yet halacha follows the Babylonian Talmud. So here is a quote from the Rebbe where he offers the following explanation for the Yiddish speakers. The second paragraph. Now, the reason for this is, as dafka de'avanav Torah, specifically in the kind of Torah that requires deep understanding and deep thinking. That's how you can come to a halacha conclusion. And therefore is the halacha dafka kabavli. And that's why the halacha follows specifically the Babylonian Talmud. From Darton is their ikka inyan from Pilpul V'Shakavataria. Because that's really where they're breaking their heads. So that was the fact that they're breaking their heads and the fact that they have a harder time with just seeing easy conclusions and therefore have to break their heads to come to them is precisely why the Rebbe says we have to follow the halacha that way. And this becomes the theme of Torah learning of the diaspora. The one who breaks his head the most and the one who pushes the limits of his mind to try to understand what's really going on, as complicated as it might be, that's often where halacha is going to follow. Because this person spent the time to really go to the depth of what's truly happening. So whereas in Eretz Yisrael, they had it easy, the tradition was given to them, that was also their downside. They didn't work to come to their conclusions as much as the ones in Babylonia did. And precisely that because the ones in Babylonia had to put their minds and work much more diligently and work through much more difficulty to come to their conclusions is why we say we're following Babylonia. And sometimes there are disputes between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, and we follow the Babylonian Talmud. And this becomes like the what's the word? The foundation of Torah learning going forward in the diaspora. This need to break the mind and try to reverse engineer every law and try to truly understand what are the roots of every law, and in that way can truly apply it to new cases and new situations that arise. And it all starts here in the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, where they have to reverse engineer the tradition and that way come to conclusions. Right? So, which is an important thing. At this point, they're almost not even using the 13 principles anymore. The principles we discussed in the previous week, how they use the principles to analyze the verse and come to conclusions, they're not really doing that anymore now. What they're doing is, they're taking the conclusions they already have and then trying to think, how did they use the 13 principles to come to their conclusions? And then let's see what they were thinking, and then we'll figure out how to apply it to new cases. And this is what happens in every generation. Where every generation, the scholars will say, okay, the previous generation had all the information we had. Why did they come to these conclusions? And if this is their reasons, then here's how we would apply here, 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 and here. Right, so as time goes on, we use the 13 principles not so much to derive our own halacha, but to understand the principles of the previous generations of halacha, and that way apply it to new cases. We're following that somewhat? Right, so this becomes the process of studying till this very day, where we have to look at the last generations of conclusions. How did you guys get here, and how do we take it to the next step? Right, this is what's going to be happening over the next weeks. Okay, just quickly, just a little bit about the structure of Jewish life in Babylon. Is that clear before we go forward? Just any questions? Is that clear? Somewhat? Yeah? Okay. So just a little bit about Jewish life, communal structure in Babylonia, which also, in some ways, till this very day, we still have the structure. And certainly, till Enlightenment, this was definitely the Jewish structure all over Europe, a little less so in the Sephardic countries, as we'll see next week, but certainly in Ashkenazi countries, this was the structure. We talked about it a little bit in the Shabbos afternoon classes, and really the structure is based on the structure of Jewish life in Israel, where you have two offices. On the left, you have the scholars learning. That's the offices of the leaders of the academies who are busy doing all this reverse engineering and all this learning and all this writing and putting their words into the Gemara. And then on the right side, you have, apparently according to Google at least, this is a remnant of the exilarch's office. And the exilarch, right, the word arch there is in monarch, but exile as in the Jewish monarch in exile. Was the Jewish political leadership. And according to our tradition, this began uninterruptedly from the first exile, when the Jews left to Babylonia during the story of Purim. That's when they established their exilarch, and it remained there with the Jews who stayed there. I mean, we have their names, and we know things they've said, and so on and so forth. It was a political office. So this became later, if you will, the board of directors and the rabbi. Right? And sometimes you come into clashes. The board of directors are paying the bills, so the rabbi has to listen, but he has to also, if he has some integrity, he's got to stand his ground even when the board of directors aren't happy. And sometimes this causes a little bit of rift, but it also keeps a good balance of power, which is no one singular Jewish office that holds all the power. There's the exilarch, and there's the sages, there's the rabbis, which later become called the Geonim, the scholars, the geniuses, if you want to call them that. So this was the overall Jewish structure of Jewish life, and it's pretty clear that the exilarch actually was installed often by the local governments. And all Jewish matters went through that person. How much taxes, where you can move, where you can't move, what jobs you can hold, all goes through that office. This became the Kehillah in Ashkenaz. We spoke about that on Shabbos. But this is the structure.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
at the beginning of this political body, would those people have been Torah scholars?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And sometimes that was controversial too. There were times when, okay, we'll get that later, where there was like controversy about Karaites even getting in there, and the sages had to push back and make sure they didn't get in there. So sometimes more, sometimes worse. Okay, so let me just show you. There's a few just passages from the Gemara where you see the interplay between the sages and the exilarch and how sometimes they run into some concerns. But I want to show you on page 8. So page 8, the context again is not so important. The Gemara is speaking about, so the Gemara in Eruvin, the Talmud is discussing the laws of the Eruv, and the Mishnah, this is an example of the Gemara reverse engineering. The Mishnah says the law regarding a private city that becomes a public city, and how you would make an Eruv there. Now that's all the information that we in Babylonia now have, a private city that becomes a public city. So the Gemara therefore asks, the Gemara that now in Babylonia we're trying to reverse engineer the Mishnah. So they read, what are the circumstances in a private city that becomes a public city? What is this? So Rabbi said, for example, the exilarch's village was a small village set aside for the exilarch's family and attendants. Since it was frequented by many people, it turned into a public city. So we already know now a little bit about the exilarch. He's got his own private city. There's families and attendants, and everybody's coming to visit him. Why are they coming to visit him? So the Gemara continues. Rav Nachman said to him, said to Rav, what is the reason for bringing this example? This particular example of a private city that becomes a public city. If you say that because large numbers of people are to be found at the residence of the governor, who's the governor? Who's the governor he's referring to? The exilarch. The exilarch had status of governor. This is another insight we're getting from the Gemara's little comment here. He has his own city, and he's considered a governor. Okay, so what's the reason for bringing this example? If you say that because a large number of people are to be found at the residence of the governor, in order to request licenses and authorizations, so if you want to do anything, you got to get permission from the exilarch. And therefore, because there's so many people, they reminded each other of the reason it is permissible to establish an Eruv there, and consequently will not arrive to mistaken conclusions with regard to other places, then every city should have the same status, as entire Jewish people are found together on Shabbat morning when they come to pray. The point he's making here is, the context is not so important, but the point he's making here is that there's a particular law here with regarding to the city where people remind each other because they remind each other, therefore they're lenient on the Eruv, and therefore he's making an argument about that. But the point of this Gemara here is if you learn two things. This guy's got his own little village, like you can imagine, like those Roman, what do they call them? Like the Roman noblemen, they were called the procutor or something like that, where they were like they were in charge of regions of land, and they were given like their own villas on top of a hill where they can like observe the whole area, and they had their own guards and their own this and their own that. You can imagine the exilarch had a very similar thing. You're like the king of the Jews. Here's your village. Here's your guards. Here's your attendants. Here's your whatever, and pay us X taxes and make sure the Jews behave. That's pretty much the arrangement. Right? That was the arrangement for the Jews in Babylonia for centuries. Okay, so here too is another Gemara on page 9. The Gemara compares the exilarch to like a political office, and then the same, and then how much time we have, but I encourage you later to read page 11, 12, and page 11 and 12, where there is a fascinating story. You can see like sometimes the rift between the exilarch and the sages, where the exilarch asks the sages for like a favor to build an Eruv, and one sage does it, another sage takes it down, and the exilarch's upset that they're not doing their job. Sometimes it's like this. Sometimes there's like rift between the two offices, and sometimes they, like I think on page 10 the example was where they have to work together. Yeah, so page 10 is an example where they work together, and page 11 and 12 where they have a little bit of rift. Okay, any questions before we go forward? Because we're coming to the conclusion of the Gemara's era. Clear? Okay. Sorry? You clear? Okay, so this is this structure. The reason why I put the structure here in the middle is because this structure, the structure of the two offices, the exilarch and the head of the academy, the study of yeshivas, kept on going till where Chabad Rebbe tells us here, end of the Babylonian schools, 1037. So we started in 200, and now we're in 1037. That's almost 800 years. And the truth is that, as we'll learn more next week, this structure kept on going afterwards, even in Babylonia, just that the gravity of power moved toward Europe, as we'll see soon next week. But this structure of two offices, the head of the academy and then the exilarch running the show in Babylonia, lasted for almost 1,000 years. It's a very long time. If you think about it, it seems like a long time ago. We put it all into one like little half an hour little talk, but it's a long time, 1,000 years.
Sorry, question.
Yeah.
So what was going on in Israel at this time? The structure.
So there were times when, throughout this entire time, there's Jews living there. There were always Jews living in Israel. This should be
Yes,
known.
Right,
Always.
yes.
And there were always Torah scholars living in Israel. Always. So a lot of the times, they're being supported by the people of Babylonia when they were doing better. Sometimes there's a struggle. Again, there was a controversy about the calendar again. And we'll talk about that soon, the controversy of the calendar, where someone in Israel wanted to do one kind of calendar, and then in Babylonia they put their foot down and say, the calendar is this way, we're keeping it universal as we always have. So sometimes there's like tension between the two communities. For the most part, it's just Jews living there and learning, like everybody else. Just not as well established as the exile. Imagine like what were Jews doing in Israel when Jews in Russia were powerful. They were living there and hopefully getting a few dollars from people in Russia.
Right.
So same kind of thing.
Population in Israel is like,
Sorry?
population in Israel now is minuscule. Like, there's probably not many people living there. Because they sent Jews
Right, so there were-
immigrants didn't move in, Goyim didn't move there.
And life was much more difficult.
Yeah.
Life much more difficult there. I mean, big populations of Jews. Today we have that in Israel. And then in like, you had some period during the Arizal's time when there was a big explosion of life in Israel then. Well before that, but for the most part, it was difficult to live there. Okay, so the Gemara is finally redacted. That is to say, these centuries of conversations where people are constantly adding lines and lines of conversation to this book that we're calling the Gemara, the Talmud, slowly starts to get less and less and less, and its final redaction is under Ravina and Ravashi, which you mentioned earlier. And there's a small period of time, which is actually the least is known about them because they didn't write much, other than adding a few lines here and there in the Talmud, is the Savaraic era that we're looking at here in the top bar. So it's it's 200 years, it's not a small period of time. But there's not really much known about the Savaraic era, other than there are certain snippets in the Gemara, there's a few lines here and there in the Gemara that are from them. And you can tell sometimes. Sorry?
How can you tell?
So usually, if the Gemara has a dispute, and then the Gemara concludes by saying, so-and-so is said to follow so-and-so, and then the Gemara will add, and the halacha is like so-and-so. Those words, the halacha is like so-and-so, is often from the Savaraic era, which is why they're sticking it in. They're saying, we discussed all this and we decided the halacha is this way, so they'll stick that line in. So sometimes you'll see it like
And
that.
that stands?
And that stands, yeah.
Halacha
Because it's
is actually.
halacha, when the Gemara says halacha is this way, it's usually not the Gemara speaking, it's actually the post-Gemara era speaking. But it's stuck into the page of the Gemara itself. I'm not on that level, but there are those who are scholarly enough to tell you that these lines are from the Savaraic era, it's not. But usually when it's Hilchas whatever, it's usually that.
So who was the, like?
There's really not a lot known about them.
Is the Geonim or?
The Geonim are much more known, as we'll see in a minute, because they write. But the Savaraic era, they don't write so much. So, Taisus makes mention,
The
sorry?
word itself calls a lot of times, the Geonim Savera.
So sometimes the Gemara will say that, and sometimes Taisus will say, I think this person's from the Savaraic, right? So like the Tchelis Maisa, the story with Tchelis, where they sent someone from Bavel to Israel to get the blue string for the dye for the tzitzis. Taisus says there, he's from the Savaraic, right? Rav Acha, I think it was. So you have different names here and there, people know, but the reasons of the fact that they didn't write much, we don't really know as much as we do about the Gemara's era, which writes tons, and then the Geonic era, which we'll see in a minute, they also write tons. Yeah, what do you want to say? No, you want to ask something?
All this was handwritten,
At the time? Yeah,
no printing yet.
no printing yet. All handwritten, which is another thing. And in later generations, there were like Rashi actually. One of the things Rashi did for his commentary, both to the Gemara specifically, is find as many versions of the Gemara as he can. And I'll sometimes say, I saw a version that says it this way, and if that's the case, the meaning is this. And if I saw a version which says that way, it's one of Rashi's things. To get the right, to find different manuscripts and see which one would be the best manuscript. Yeah, it's all handwritten. Okay, so after the Gemara is finally redacted, Jews start slowly moving away from Bavel, and they start moving, well, pretty much everywhere, including North Africa and Europe. And the Jews who are, let's say, today we would call the Lebanese Jews, the Iraqi Jews, the Iranian Jews, the Yemenite Jews, most of these Jews never left. They were there the entire time. Right? The Yemenite Jews especially hold the longest line of just direct non-moving from one place and have tradition that goes back for generations, which is why their accent is probably more closer to original Hebrew than ours is. It hasn't been diluted by all the countries you've been to. Their pronunciation of Hebrew is much more accurate, which is why every single letter for them is different. For us, a Saf and a Samach are the same, not for the Yemenites. Every letter is different. They're much more accurate. But anyway, Jews start leaving Bavel, and next week we'll see much more how the center of power moves away from Bavel and starts going towards Europe, Ashkenazim and Sephardim. But for these centuries, during the Geonim period, there are Jews living all over, but the center of Jewish life remains in Bavel. Still remains in Bavel. And then what happens is, these other communities who are living out wherever, they have a much harder time, obviously, studying the Gemara or the Mishnah, as do the people who are still in the same academies where the Mishnah was written, or not the Mishnah, but the Gemara was written, in Pumbedisa and Surah, these same places where a couple hundred years earlier, the people were putting their conversations into the Gemara. The Geonim are still giving classes there. The Geonim being the other office, not the political office, but the Torah office. The leader of that would be called the Goy, the genius, right? So they're still there, so they can study Gemara all well and great and can come to halacha conclusions. But if you're living out in the middle of wherever, and you went there for a business opportunity, and a few families went, and you're establishing a community slowly, whatever, and you need to know, like, how do we live? We have questions that are coming up. So you'll send your question to the Center of Jewish Life in Bavel. And usually, you'll send it with a check. You'll send a donation with a question, and you'll get back a thank you and an answer. That's what usually happened. And this is why we know so much about the Geonim more than the generation before them. Because they were writing much more. So they're sending letters all over Europe and North Africa, answering halacha questions, and as a result, we know about them. So I'm just going to give 3 examples of such Geonim who would respond to questions that came from all over. The first is Rav Amram Goin. You can see his ears. He's in Surah. Surah is one of the towns in Bavel, in Babylonia, that had this center of Torah learning. And I'm just this. Okay, so this is an introduction to his siddur. The earliest known siddur is Rav Amram Goin's siddur. So we talked a little bit about prayer last week, where the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly, after the return of the exile, building the second temple, they started to formulate Judaism, seeing that Jews are starting to move out of Eretz Yisrael, and they were the first one to put a structure to the siddur. But a structure to the siddur, a structure to prayer, doesn't mean hear the words you say. A structure means make sure you cover these topics, make sure the topics are written in this order, make sure you open up the word Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, things like that. It's not word for word, it's just an overall structure. Now, following that structure, different communities may have done different things, all following the same structure. So now there's a community out in, according to my little research, Barcelona in Spain, who aren't sure how to properly pray using this structure just by looking at the Talmud. Because we just learned that the Talmud is very convoluted. So to extrapolate from the Gemara exactly what words to say would be very difficult. So they write to Babylonia and they say, well, can you please help us out here? We're trying to create a structure that we can all pray together. Because you know what a minyan is. The Talmud talks about a minyan. And the Talmud talks about some sort of structure for prayer, but we don't really know what we're doing. Can you help us out here? So he writes back a letter with, here's the order of how you pray in the morning. Here's what you say, here's when you stand, here's when you sit, here's when you go here, when you go there, and he's the first one to put it into paper. Jews were obviously doing it before. He got it from those, but if you're in the yeshiva, we're all doing it, so we're all just doing it, just follow the leader. But he's the first one to put it on paper, again, this idea of making sure Torah is transgeographic. So he's got to put now all these practices that have been passed down from generation to generation, he's got to put it on paper, send it off to some people in Spain, because they're not here, and now they can do it.
This is like the beginning of the halakhic body of
The post-Talmudic body of halacha. First comes in responsa. That's correct. It first comes in responsa. right? Where we're answering letters to people all over, because we here in Babylon know how to learn the Talmud. We know how to derive halacha. We have our Geonim, we have our genius, who will do it for us with his group of scholars. But us stuck in North Africa or in the Rhineland, we don't know what to do. So we'll send a letter there. They send a letter back. And now we start to have texts that give us these conclusions and their rationale for their conclusions, as well as a siddur. So what's interesting about this one is that it makes a mention of a donation. So I'm just translating just translating directly. Was sent to us by Rabbi Yaakov, son of Rabbi Yitzchak, 10 gold, 10 like gold coins that you sent for our yeshiva. 5 for us, I guess that's for the office of the leader, and 5 for the fund that supports the yeshiva. And we bless you for this. And you asked us to bless you, and we indeed bless you with blessings that should stand for you, for your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Now, attached here is the order of prayer and blessings for the entire year, as you requested. So here's how we're going to do it. As we know from our tradition going back to the days of Tanaim, authors of the Mishnah, the Amoraim, the authors of the Gemara. So he tells them, thank you very much for your donation, here are your blessings, and here is your siddur that you requested. The first siddur ever to be written in paper. Another example, just because I can't pass over, besides Geonim, probably the most famous of them, finding a text from him was very, very, very colorful personality. I recommend looking them up, Geonim, and Googling. When we move back to Shabbos afternoon and we do individual personalities, we're going to look at Geonim because he's a very, very big personality. Just here's a list of some things that he did in his lifetime in terms of Torah law. He defended the calendar. I mentioned this earlier. There was a fellow in Israel, whose name I can't remember, who argued against a certain version of the calendar and wanted to change the date of Pesach, and it caused a whole ruckus, and Geonim put an end to it, wrote a whole book defending the calendar as we have it, so preserve that, and which also further solidified that Babylonia is the center of Jewish life. He also dealt with Karaites. Karaites are people we mentioned last week, during the end of the Second Temple period, who rejected the rabbinic authority and espoused to be deriving Jewish law directly from the text of the Chumash. And this was an ongoing problem for a long time. And Rabbi Geonim deals with them and writes a bunch of books to refute their ways and refute their thinking and so on and so forth. And the crux of all the arguments is that the Torah cannot be read without interpretation. And if you think you're doing it without interpretation, you're just being dishonest because you actually are interpreting. You're just not admitting you're interpreting. That's essentially what it comes down to, because you can't practice from the Chumash without interpretation. It's just not possible. And to claim that you're not interpreting is just to insert your own interpretation. Whereas at least I can say my interpretation comes from generations before me. Right? So that's essentially what these polemics come down to. Geonim is also very well known for first formulating Jewish philosophy, which is not our subject of this course, but maybe we'll do that another time, the evolution of Jewish philosophy, and he would stand out as a major thinker in Jewish philosophy, just to say theology, understanding the nature of God, and what do we mean by reward and punishment, and Mashiach, and really giving articulation for Jewish theology, is Rabbi Geonim. He was also, I think, the first, certainly amongst the first, to enumerate the mitzvahs. Just to explain briefly, the Talmud tells us by tradition that there are 613 mitzvahs, 613 commandments. Now, if you read through the Torah, you're not going to find post-it notes that tell you what number of mitzvah you're looking at. So you have to figure out on your own how to get to 613. So how do you do that? Is to fill in 2 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah? Is Yom Kippur 1 mitzvah? Or is it 5 mitzvahs? Don't eat, don't drink, is that a separate one? Is fasting a separate mitzvah from don't eat? Right? Like this, on and on and on. You can look at each verse and break it down. 1 mitzvah, 2 mitzvahs, 5 mitzvahs. Like, for example, this is a classic one. Is the mitzvah to build a temple and all the details included? Or is the menorah a separate mitzvah? The mizbeach a separate mitzvah? And each item another mitzvah on its own of the 613? Or is it 1 mitzvah, build a temple, that has a bunch of details? Right? So these are things you have to figure out how to do, which require a broad knowledge of all Torah, the text, and all the Talmud. Because you have to have all the years of interpretation in your mind to be able to go through the entire list and list 613. I believe Rabbi Geonim was the first one to do so. Later, in the generations after him, it became like a thing where there was many people who came along to enumerate the 613, and not always do they agree. Sometimes they disagree on what the 613 are. He also wrote a siddur, building on Rav Amram Gaon's siddur, He translated the Torah into Judaic Arabic for a crowd that wasn't apt at reading Hebrew, as well as halachic responsa. Okay, maybe one day we'll have occasion to look more into his life.
Was a poet also, no?
And he was a poet, yeah, that's right. Poetry begins here, so it's another one of those things. If we did like the history of the Siddur, it'd be a whole other thing. And history of Jewish philosophy would be a whole other thing, right? But yeah, he was a poet. Rabbi Saadia Gaon was a poet. Very prolific writer. Okay. And finally, we have Rabbi Shabira Gaon, who the last two, Rav Amram and Rav Saadia, were both Gaonim in the town of Sura, one of the big academies in Babylonia. And they don't overlap. You see, Amram Gaon passes away in 875, and Rav Saadia Gaon is born in 882, a little after. But Rav Shira Gaon, as you can see here, overlaps with Rav Saadia. Rav Saadia dies in 942, and Rav Shira Gaon passes in 940. So they overlap. But they're in different towns. One's in Surda, one's in Pupedita, another one of the cities that we had on the map earlier. Now this is the intro to a letter that actually, in many ways, this entire lecture series is, at least up until this point, is built on this letter. He got a letter from the rabbis in a city in North Africa called Kiron, if anyone knows what it is. Kiron, somewhere in North Africa. It's written here in Hebrew. Shalom Rabbanon Kiron. I was asked by the rabbis of Kiron. Leishara Yeshiva L'Makam HaBezdin Shemorenu Rabbeinu Nishina Rabshira Ben Rabchanina Ben Rabbeinu Huda. A letter was sent, question from the community in Kiron to the yeshiva, where sits at the head Rabbi Shira, son of Rabbi Chanina, son of Rabbi Huda. And they came with the following questions for him, as well as Rabbeinu Hai Gaon, another one of the sages of that era. And the questions that they ask him are, who wrote the Mishnah? How was it written? Who are the Anshe Knesset Agdala? How did we get there? How does the Gemara work? They want to know everything. Just explain to us how this whole thing works. And he wrote a whole long, famous letter called the Geras Sherdita Gaon. And a lot of what we learned until today is actually built on this letter. Built in this letter, right? Although, in certain respects, Rambam disagrees with Rosh Gaon and we follow Rambam, but nonetheless, a lot of the information comes from this letter of Shira Gaon, responding to this community in North Africa asking these questions. So, sorry?
Fundamentally, they disagree, but like
in certain details.
There are certain details.
Like, for example, I remember, last week we talked about one of them. I can't remember. There was a certain detail actually that we put Rambam in last week rather than Shira Gaon. Small details about like who lives where, or when, or who communicates with who. Things, not major fundamental questions. So this brings us to the conclusion of the Gaonic era, and really the conclusion of Babylonia being the center of Jewish life. And this becomes, we're starting to see the beginning of a split in Jewish life. So until now, we went to the diaspora, we still stayed in one place. Right? We were, for 1,000 years, we were in Eretz Yisrael, until we wrote the Mishnah, because we had to move, we had to become trans-geographic. And then we went to Babylonia, and we were there for almost 1,000 years. But in the years of the Geonim, where we see them corresponding with other communities, and more importantly, we see them taking donations. Whereas earlier, Babylonia would have been supporting Israel. And people moved away from Israel to Babylonia because they were the wealthier ones. But now, as we're seeing in these letters, they're receiving donations from other communities. So how long does it take for these communities to say, you know what, if we're sending money out all the way out there, let's just sponsor someone to come here and establish our own yeshiva. And that's essentially what starts to happen. Where eventually, the center of Torah learning moves away from Babylonia along with the opportunity and the money. Where you can support Torah learning, that's where it's going to go. And that slowly brings us to next week, God willing, when we look at the era of the Rishonim, and we start to see a split between Ashkenaz and Sfarad, these two major centers of Jewish wealth and therefore Jewish learning, where each of them sponsor their own scholars coming from Babylonia to establish their own yeshivas that eventually start to make the split between the Sephardic and Ashkenazic. Rabbi Gershon in Ashkenaz and Rabbi Chazdei ben Shiprut in Sfarad start to create these different centers of Jewish life, and then Babylonia, even though they're still around for a little while afterwards, starts to lose its draw. and questions stop coming to Babylonia, and they start going to Spain, or they start going to Rashi, and others like that. We'll see God willing next week. Any questions before we close out?
I'm just curious, is there any like in the history of Babylonia from after this point, was there any major exoduses or pogroms or anything like that, or any attacks that happened in Babylonia that forced the Jews out, or was it just purely economics?
I don't know. I know that like even till today there's like this whole discussion amongst historians exactly how Ashkenazim got to Ashkenaz. Because now with DNA testing they have a new theory, they used to have an old theory. So I'm not quite sure. Same thing with Spain, by the way. Did they come through, did they go like through Turkey and around through Germany and then like France down to Spain, or do they go through North Africa and come that way? So it's I don't know. I don't know if there's a cataclysmic event that makes people to move. Like Spain comes to a cataclysmic end, right?
Yeah.
That's the expulsion. And even Ashkenaz, you can delineate times. They're kicked out of here, they move to there. You know, this king wasn't Lemstad, they moved to Poland. And this king was they had to go to Ukraine, and farther east. And then the pogroms happened, they went that way. Like,
I was just curious.
it could be it's just too far away, so you don't really know.
I was just curious what happened if they left the center of
I don't know if there was an event that caused it to happen. Anyway, so if last week what we got was the foundations of Jewish learning, the written Torah and the oral Torah, as in using the principles of interpretation, now what we're seeing is that as we move forward, our job becomes to reverse engineer and try to dig up what were they thinking, how did they use the rules to come to their conclusions, and by that way, apply it to the new cases. And then when we go to the split between Ashkenaz and Sfarad, where they're each doing the same exact thing, but come to different conclusions, we start to see different communities practice in different ways. That's God willing coming next week. So thank you all for joining, and looking forward to continuing.
Thank you.